They say weddings bring families together, but on that winter afternoon, mine came undone. The moment the quiet stranger stepped into the barn-turned chapel, the air shifted, like the field behind our house had finally exhaled the secret it had held for years. By the time he spoke, my son's smile had already begun to tremble. My name is Ellen Hart, and for most of my life, I've lived on a modest stretch of farmland my husband inherited from his father. The soil is stubborn, the winter's long, and our family history is stitched with more silence than truth. My son, Daniel, was the one bright thread, gentle, hardworking, too innocent to know the weight adults carry. On his wedding day, our weathered barn was filled with music, candlelight, and the scent of pine, yet a strange heaviness lingered in the corners. It wasn't until the quiet stranger arrived, hat in hand, that I realized the past had come to sit among us. The barn doors were still half open when I first noticed him. Light from the late afternoon sun stretched across the floor in long, wavering lines, dust floating through it like slow, drifting snow. Everyone else was busy finding their seats, brushing hay from their shoes, or laughing too loudly the way people do when they're trying to settle their nerves. But he didn't move with them. He slipped into the last row so quietly that even the floorboards didn't seem to react. And before I knew why, my breath caught, like my body recognized something my mind didn't. The musicians were still tuning, faint plucks of a guitar, the uncertain hum of a fiddle. That sound always reminded me of winter mornings, when the house stretched and woke in its own slow way. I tried to focus on it, to let it settle me, but my gaze kept drifting to the back of the barn. He sat alone. Dust clung to the hem of his trousers, the kind you only got from long roads or work that didn't end when the daylight did. His hat was in his hands, turning slowly between his fingers. But it was his eyes that held me. Not because they looked dangerous, but because they didn't look at anything inside the room. Everyone else was facing the altar where Daniel would soon stand, under the pine garland we'd woven the night before. But this man, his gaze went past it, past the old beams, past the smiling guests, straight to the field behind the wall. That field had been frozen since the storm 3 nights prior, the soil stiff and pale. I hadn't stepped near it since the morning Mark mentioned the drainage lines again. Every time he said the word field, something tightened between us. And now here was a stranger staring at it, like he knew its stories better than we did. A soft cough behind me broke my focus. My cousin Ruth was adjusting her shawl, settling into the row ahead of me. "Ruth," I whispered, leaning forward. "Do you know him?" "Back row, brown coat." She followed my gaze, squinting. "No," she said after a moment. "Thought he was with your side." I shook my head. He wasn't with mine. Of that, I felt certain. The musicians struck a slow chord, a signal that seating was almost finished. Chairs shifted. People hushed. The air changed. Still, the man didn't lift his eyes from that same invisible point on the far wall. A strange pressure settled low in my stomach. Not fear. Something quieter. Something older. As the last guests found their seats, I noticed the stranger straighten a little. Not much, just enough that the movement caught my eye. He pressed a hand briefly to his chest, right over his ribs, as if bracing himself for pain that hadn't arrived yet, or pain that had never left. For a moment, I imagined he was someone's lost uncle, or a neighbor from years ago, come to wish Daniel well. But no one greeted him. No one nodded as they passed. It was as if the room parted around him without realizing it. I tried to shake it off. Tried to focus on my son. Daniel was near the side door, talking softly with his best man. He looked steady, nervous, yes, but glowing the way a groom should. I let myself watch him for a moment, memorizing the way the light touched the side of his face. He had Mark's jawline and my father's quiet eyes. Then Daniel turned toward the seats. His eyes skimmed the crowd, quick, searching for me. When he found me, he smiled, small but sure. But the smile didn't last, because as he looked past me, his gaze snagged on the man in the back row. I saw the shift happen the way a mother sees every small change in her child. His brow tightened just slightly. His mouth stilled. His breath caught, then steadied too quickly, the way people do when they recognize something they don't want to recognize. The stranger didn't lift his head, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge anything. Yet Daniel stared at him like he was a half-remembered face from a dream. I watched my son swallow hard before looking away. A quiet unease curled under my skin. The officiant entered then, smoothing his coat and smiling with that rehearsed, warm expression meant to settle everyone. People shifted eagerly, straightening in their seats, leaning toward the aisle where the bridal march would soon begin. But I couldn't look toward the bride. Not why ET.my eyes had locked onto the strangers again. This time, he finally lifted his gaze from the far wall. Not toward the altar. Not toward the door. Toward Daniel. And there was something in the way he looked at my son. Something so raw, so quietly aching, that it almost felt indecent to witness that it wasn't recognition. Not exactly that it was longing, a soft, grieving kind of longing that made no sense to me, that I found myself gripping the edge of my seat, knuckles pale. Why would a man my son didn't know stare at him like that? Why would someone who claimed no connection to us sit through a wedding rehearsal with dust on his sleeves? And grief in his eyes? The musicians shifted into a slow, familiar melody, the one Daniel chose because it felt like home. But suddenly, nothing felt like home. Not the barn. Not the warmth in the air. Not even the field outside, silent and waiting beneath its layer of frost, that a thought I didn't want crept into the back of my mind, whispering with the cold clarity only unwanted truths carry. What if this man wasn't here for the wedding? What if he was here for us? The guests began turning in their seats as the first notes of the processional drifted through the barn. Faces brightened. Murmurs softened. The doors at the far end eased open to let the bride step into the light. But all I could do was sit frozen, heart ticking too loudly in my ears, eyes locked on the stranger who hadn't moved since he walked in. He watched my son like someone waiting for a moment that had been owed to him for years. And in that quiet, breathless instant, as music filled the room, one question settled heavy and cold at the back of my mind. The cold hit me the second I pushed the barn door open, sharp, clean, the kind of cold that carries every sound a little farther than it should. The caterers were unloading crates from the back of a van, their breath rising in soft white puffs. But I barely noticed them. My eyes went straight to the field, it stretched out behind the barn like an old memory someone had tried to bury under snow. Pale ridges. Long shadows. A quiet that felt too heavy for something made of dirt and ice. I told myself I'd stepped out to help, but the truth was simple. I needed air. I needed distance from the stranger. From the way he looked at things that weren't meant to be looked at. The field had always been a part of our life. Work, harvests, seasons marked by the weight of the soil. But winter made it look different. The snow smoothed everything out, gave the land a kind of eerie mercy, hiding every line my husband had carved into it over the years. I stood there, holding my coat closed with one hand, listening to the wind scrape across the barn siding. The caterers kept talking behind me, something about missing napkins, something about stacking trays, but their words felt distant. All I could hear was the quiet, familiar quiet, unwanted quiet. It had been years since I'd let myself really look at that field. Not since the night Mark came home soaked through, mud up to his knees, breathing hard like he'd run the whole length of the county. He said he'd been turning the soil before rain. But even then, the words felt thin. Unsteady. A man doesn't prepare for rain at midnight. Not with trembling hands. The memory rose in my throat like cold water. I swallowed it down, the way I had every time it tried to surface over the years. The field didn't look dangerous today. Just lonely, just frozen, just waiting. I wrapped my coat tighter and turned away before it pulled me into another memory I wasn't ready to face. When I stepped back into the barn, the warmth wrapped around me in a slow wave, music drifting faintly from the speakers, someone laughing too loud, the shuffle of chairs being set straight, normal sounds, safe sounds, but he was there. The stranger stood near the east wall, in front of the old framed photograph we'd hung years ago. A panorama of the farm before the barn was restored, before the fences leaned, before life pressed down on all of us a little harder than expected. He didn't touch the picture. Just stood there, studying it with a stillness that felt deliberate. Reverent almost. I froze halfway down the aisle. No one else seemed to notice him. Just another guest, standing too far from the punch bowl to draw attention. But something about the way he tilted his head, the way his gaze was fixed on the field in that photograph, made my stomach fold in on itself. I watched his hand rise slowly, almost unconsciously, to trace the air near the image, right over the northern edge of the field. The part that sloped down toward the tree line. The part Mark always avoided discussing. The part he'd been working that night. A soft creak came from the floorboards as I took a step closer. The stranger didn't turn, didn't shift. Just kept staring at the picture like it held an answer he'd been chasing for years. Behind me, someone dropped a fork. A child giggled. The bride's sister was complaining about her hair. All the everyday noise swirled around him, but he didn't move. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was remembering something. Or searching for something. Something buried too deep for the rest of us to see. I stood close enough now to read the small caption under the photograph. Hart Farm, 1984. The year Mark's father died. The year the property passed to us. The stranger leaned in just slightly, shadow falling across the frame. The muscles in his jaw tightened, a small, barely there movement. Like something in the image hurt to look at. My breath thinned, that he wasn't just admiring an old photograph. His gaze kept pulling back to the far right corner of the field. The same spot I'd avoided looking at for nearly 2 decades. The same spot Mark had dug through until rain turned the soil into dark, clinging ropes. That I suddenly felt 14 again, standing at my own mother's table, listening to adults talk in hushed tones about things not meant for children's ears. That same quiet dread curled under my ribs now that I took another step, slow enough not to draw attention. Still, he didn't turn. He whispered something then. Too soft to catch, but it carried the tone of someone speaking to a ghost. Someone asking a question only the dead might answer. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. Why was he looking there? Why did he know to look there? And why did his face soften? Not in fear, but in grief, as he stared at soil he'd never worked and land he shouldn't recognize. The music shifted to something brighter, livelier. People began gathering near the front as the officiant announced the ceremony would start soon. But the stranger didn't move. He just kept staring at the land in that photograph like he knew exactly what lay beneath it. I backed away before he noticed me watching. My hands felt cold, even in the warmth of the barn. The noise around me rose again, chairs scraping, dresses rustling, people smiling. All the signs of a happy day, but something in me stayed fixed on the field. On the memory of mud under Mark's nails. On the stranger's quiet, searching eyes. For the first time in years, the question I'd buried just as deep as the winter soil pushed its way back to the surface. What happened in that field the night he said he was only turning the soil? And why did this stranger look like he already knew the answer? The wind was barely a breeze that morning, just enough to move the petals scattered across the aisle. I remember standing near the arbor, smoothing the front of my dress, pretending my hands weren't shaking from something I couldn't name. Weddings have a way of stirring old ghosts, but this time, it felt different. I noticed him before he noticed me. A quiet man standing alone near the last row of chairs, as if he'd been dropped into the crowd rather than invited to it. And when our eyes finally met, it felt like someone had opened a door I didn't know existed. The morning had started gently enough. The sun was low, the music soft, and the air held that mix of perfume and soil that only a garden wedding can manage. My son was somewhere inside the farmhouse, laughing with his friends, and I kept telling myself to breathe like all mothers do on days like this. Slow, steady, hopeful. I walked the edge of the lawn, checking on the chairs, the flowers, the little things that never really matter but somehow feel like they do. I wanted everything to be right for him. For once, it felt like the world wasn't holding its breath over us. But the moment I saw that man, the one with the gray-blue tie and the posture of someone raised to speak softly, I felt something tug inside me. Not fear. Not even curiosity. More like recognition without reason. He didn't mingle. Didn't approach the groom's side or the bride's. He just stood there under the shade of an oak, hands folded in front of him, watching the field beyond the fence instead of the wedding. Our field. The one we'd worked, fought, and nearly lost. The one that still turned to a river every spring. I tried to look away. I tried to lose him in the blur of guests. But he held stillness the way some people hold a secret. Gently, with both hands. I was adjusting a ribbon on the arch when I sensed someone walking toward me. His footsteps were quiet, the kind you don't hear until the person is already close enough to touch your shoulder. "Mrs. Hart?" His voice was soft. Softer than the breeze, even. I turned, expecting someone from the catering staff, or maybe one of the bride's distant relatives. But it was him. The stranger with the watchful eyes. Up close, he looked younger than I first thought, though something about him carried age. Maybe it was the way he held himself, with a kind of deliberate gentleness. "Yes?" I answered. He nodded politely, like he was greeting an old friend rather than a woman he'd never met. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. I had a question. People ask strange things at weddings, directions, schedules, where to place gifts, but the way he paused made the air shift around us. "Does the field still flood in spring?" His words landed like cold water down the spine. Not the question itself. We've dealt with that flood for years, but the way he said it, like he knew the rhythm of our seasons, like he'd stood ankle-deep in that same muddy water. Like someone remembering the feel of your soil under their hands. Before I could blink, before I could breathe enough to answer, the officiant called out, "Everyone please take your seats." The stranger stepped back at the announcement, offering a small, almost apologetic smile. "We can talk later," he murmured. Later, as if conversation between us was already promised. He walked away, blending into the movement of guests taking their seats. But I watched him the way someone watches a shadow that shouldn't be there. He moved with a kind of familiarity, not with people, but with place. His eyes drifted again toward the field, lingering on the far corner where the earth dips just enough to hold spring water like a hand cupping rain. Only someone who had walked that land would know to look there. Only someone who had been part of its story. I tried to focus on the ceremony ahead, but my heart wouldn't settle. The question echoed in me, quiet but steady. Does the field still flood in spring? There are things you live with long enough that they become part of your bones. That flood was one of them. As the guests murmured and shuffled into their chairs, I found myself searching for the stranger again. For the way he held his hands. For the way he spoke my name. But he'd already taken his seat at the far end of the aisle, half hidden behind two guests who didn't seem to know him either. Yet his presence pressed against me like a memory trying to surface. As the music began, and my son stepped out into the warm, bright silence, everyone turned toward him. Smiles rose like sunlight on faces all around me. But mine faltered for a moment. Because in the corner of my eye, I saw the stranger tilt his head, watching the field instead of the bride, his expression soft and almost mournful. Like he wasn't attending a wedding. Like he was returning to a place he once left behind. The ceremony would go on. Vows would be spoken. Hands would be joined. But all I could feel was that question settling into me like a stone dropped into still water. The barn was warm with lantern light, all golden flickers and soft dust drifting in slow curls. Guests whispered in pew-like rows, their breath fogging faintly in the pockets of cold that clung to the rafters. My son stood beneath the arch we built from old oak limbs, steady shoulders, polished boots, hands folded together like a prayer he wasn't sure he could keep. But even from where I sat, I saw it. His eyes weren't on the aisle. They were fixed on the far back corner of the barn, where one man stood in a shadow that the lanterns never seemed able to reach. And Daniel, my unshakable boy, was afraid. Weddings aren't supposed to feel like this, like a held breath that no one wants to release. The musicians played a slow, lilting tune, something with strings and a soft hum, but it felt swallowed by the barn's old wood. People smiled, whispered, nudged elbows. A normal ceremony, by all appearances. But I kept my hands clasped too tightly in my lap, my knuckles pale, nails pressing half-moons into my palms. I couldn't stop glancing behind me, toward that still figure near the barn door. He hadn't moved since he slipped inside, that didn't shift his weight, that didn't fuss with his coat or wipe the cold from his shoes. Just stood there, hands in front of him, head lowered slightly, as if attending a funeral instead of a wedding. Daniel kept looking back at him. Small glances, quick, almost shy. That wasn't like him. My son had always been good under pressure, calm in storms, steady even as a child. He'd once carried a wounded calf from the field by himself, holding its trembling legs as if they were made of glass. But now, here, something in that shadowed figure rattled him. Mark, my husband, sat beside me. He shifted in his seat, rubbing a hand across his jaw. A quiet, restless gesture I'd learned long ago meant recognition, of a face, of a story, or of trouble. The vows hadn't even begun, and already the air felt different. Too tight, too full of things unsaid. When the music shifted, everyone rose. The bride stepped into view, glowing the way brides do, soft blush, lace-catching light, a smile trembling at the edges. The guests made a collective sound, a gentle sigh of admiration. Everyone watched her. Everyone except Daniel. His eyes flicked to her only for a heartbeat, then back, again. To the man in the shadows that I watched his throat tighten as she reached him. The officiant cleared his voice and began, speaking warm words about love and seasons and the quiet work of building a life together. It should have washed over me like comfort, but my gaze kept drifting between my son and the uninvited figure who refused to look away from him. When it came time for Daniel to repeat his vows, he drew a breath too sharp to hide. I, Daniel Hart, except the words didn't come out smooth, they broke, just slightly. His bride squeezed his hand. A soft, reassuring gesture. I saw her thumb stroke his knuckles, grounding him the way she had through exams, through job changes, through the small, uncertain corners of life that he tried again. I, Daniel Hart, take you. But his voice wavered, enough that guests exchanged glances. Enough that a hush fell heavier than before. He swallowed, eyes darting, just once, toward the back, toward that still, silent man, and something cold settled in my chest. Fear, but not of danger, fear of truth. Truth has a way of showing up in the middle of joy, uninvited, unavoidable. Mark leaned closer to me, his voice barely a breath. "Ellen, do you see him?" "I see him," I whispered back. But what I didn't understand was the flicker in Mark's face. Recognition, yes, but also dread. The ceremony went on. Words passed. Rings were exchanged. The bride's voice held steady, her vows soft, full of light. She didn't notice Daniel's glances, or maybe she did and chose to trust his tremor into stillness. But the stranger, he never moved. Not even when applause began to swell. As the couple kissed. Gentle, nervous, sweet. The guests rose in cheer, clapping and wiping eyes. I stood with them, but my hands barely made a sound. I was watching the back of the barn. And for the first time that entire ceremony, the stranger lifted his gaze and met Daniel's eyes fully. Daniel froze. Not visibly, not enough for anyone else to see. But I know my son. I know the way his breath changes when he's bracing for something he hoped would never come. Mark's hand tightened around the back of the pew. He didn't clap, didn't smile. Just stared at the man as if he were watching a story he'd once buried rise from the earth beneath us. There was history here. Not mine, not the bride's. Not even Daniel's alone. Something deeper, older. Sharp enough to tear through a wedding day without saying a single word. When the ceremony ended, the barn erupted with warmth, hugs, flowers, soft chatter. The bride laughed against Daniel's shoulder, and he kissed her hair, all the while wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mark slipped a hand into his pocket, the way he always did when preparing for a conversation he didn't want to have. And the stranger, he stepped back into the cold draft near the barn door, becoming part of the dimness again, watching us with a patience that felt like an old debt waiting to be paid. I stood there, surrounded by celebration, yet utterly alone with one quiet question. What truth could make both my husband and my son afraid of the same silent man? The answer, I sensed, wasn't in the wedding. It was in the shadow he came from. And shadows rarely come without purpose. The lights in the old barn were soft, the kind that made everything look like memory. People moved slow, drifting between tables with half-finished plates and the sweet smell of peach cobbler. I remember the clinking first, glasses touching like timid bells, laughter folding into the beams above us. But something in the air felt off, like a draft slipping through a door someone forgot to close. I didn't notice him at first. Not until the room hushed just slightly, the way a field quiets right before rain. And then he stood, holding his glass like he was offering it to the past instead of the bride and groom. Receptions always make me nervous. Too many faces pretending they aren't tired. Too many stories polished until they shine in the wrong places. I sat there with my napkin folded on my lap, watching Mark laugh with his friends, that familiar, practiced laugh he'd used since he was a boy. The barn smelled of hay and old wood warmed by lanterns. Every so often, a gust outside rattled the metal roof, and the sound slipped into the music like a warning no one wanted to hear. The toasts had been harmless so far. Predictable, to love, to family, to second chances. I nodded when everyone else did, even smiled when someone made a joke about Mark's dance moves. But he didn't look at me. Not once. It wasn't avoidance. It was something heavier, a quiet stiffness in his shoulders, as if he were bracing for something he couldn't name. That's when the stranger pushed his chair back. Slow, deliberate, a scrape of wood on wood that shouldn't have carried as far as it did. He lifted his glass without waiting for the music to fade. And just like that, the barn began listening in a way people rarely do anymore. He wasn't dressed like the others. His jacket a touch too worn, his boots dusty in a way that didn't match the occasion. But his posture was steady. A man who'd spoken hard truths before and survived their echo. To the groom, he began, his voice a calm ripple across the tables. A young man who's grown tall on the soil of his father and those before him. A few people smiled politely. A couple of heads tilted, trying to place him. I felt something else, a prickle, like he had reached straight through the years and tugged at a thread we'd all stepped around. He kept going. Some of us rise from land we think we understand. But the ground remembers more than we do. It shapes us quiet, in ways we don't see until the day truth calls our name. The clinking stopped. Forks lowered. Even the lantern flames seemed to shrink. I glanced at Mark. His fingers curled around the edge of his chair, knuckles paling as if he were holding on to keep from being seen. The stranger's eyes rested on him, not unkind, but unyielding, like he was offering him a choice. To listen, or to remember. People exchanged looks. Someone coughed. But the stranger didn't waver. With that, he said softly, lifting his glass a little higher, I offer this wish, that truth always come before land. A simple sentence. Gentle, even. But it dropped into the air with the weight of a stone thrown into still water. No one moved. The barn had been loud just minutes earlier. Plates clattering, guests laughing, music weaving between conversations. Now it felt like the beams themselves were holding their breath. Mark finally looked at me. Not long, just a flicker, a moment so quick it could have been imagined. But his eyes were tight, the way they used to get when he was little, and had done something he wasn't ready to confess. I felt it then. Not understanding, not yet. Just a shift. Like the stranger had opened a door we didn't know was there. He sat down as quietly as he'd stood. No satisfaction on his face, no trace of drama. Just a man who had said what he came to say. Around us, confusion stirred. "Who is he?" someone whispered. "What does that mean?" murmured another, but their questions felt far away. All I could see was Mark, still gripping the chair, jaw locked, breath shallow. As if the toast had been an accusation meant only for him, wrapped in polite words no one else could decipher. And maybe it was. The music eventually started again, but it sounded different, thinner, wandering, like it didn't know where to land. People tried to force smiles back onto their faces, but their eyes kept drifting toward the stranger, then to Mark, then to me. I stayed seated, watching the lanterns sway gently overhead. A quiet rhythm, a reminder that some truths arrive without asking permission. Mark let go of the chair at last, his hand trembling for just a breath before he tucked it out of sight. Outside, the wind brushed against the barn doors, carrying the scent of damp earth. Soil that remembers. Soil that keeps. And for the first time since the wedding began, I realized something had been buried long before tonight, and someone had just begun to unearth it. The cold hit me first, sharp enough to quiet the noise still ringing in my ears from inside the barn. The door eased shut behind me, muting the laughter until it became nothing more than a memory pretending to be real. Out in the dark, the field opened wide, its frost-tipped grass glowing under the moon like a silver bruise. Mark stood alone near the fence line, shoulders hunched, breath rising in slow, uneven clouds. He didn't turn when he heard my footsteps. Just kept staring into the open land like it held a debt he hadn't paid yet. For a moment, I wondered if he even knew I was his mother standing there behind him. The air felt heavier than it should have for a wedding night. Not with sadness, with something older, deeper, something that had been waiting under the soil long before tonight. The music inside drifted through the wood slats of the barn, muffled and too cheerful for the silence out here. Mark's hands were stuffed deep into his pockets, the way he used to stand when he was a boy trying to hide the tremble in them. Back then, he'd come to me with scraped knees or broken toys, hoping I'd fix what he didn't have words for. Now he was taller than the fence post, broader than the man he used to be, but I could see it all the same. That tremble lived somewhere inside him still. "I just needed air," he muttered when I got close enough. His voice was thin, strained around the edges. "You left quick," I said softly. "Did his toast bother you?" He let out a short laugh, but it had no warmth. It was just talk. But he didn't lift his head, didn't meet my eyes. And the way the moon caught the tightness in his jaw told me all I needed to know. It wasn't just talk. He was afraid of that man. Deeply. Silently I stepped beside him, leaving space between us the way you do with an animal that might bolt if you move too fast. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The fence creaked as the wind pushed against it, and Mark breathed harder, like the cold couldn't quite fill his lungs. "Who is he?" I asked, though my voice barely carried above the grass shifting around us. "No one important," he said too quickly. Too cleanly. Like he'd practiced it. "Mark." The name came out gentler than I expected, but it still struck him. His shoulders tightened, and he finally lifted his hand to wipe his face. A wound of a gesture, quick and ashamed. When he spoke again, his voice cracked. Not like someone who'd been drinking. Like someone whose ribcage wasn't strong enough to hold back the truth anymore. "He shouldn't have come," he whispered. Inside the barn, applause erupted for something. A toast, a dance, a joke. Out here, it sounded like the world clapping for the wrong moment. "Tell me," I said. "Please." He shook his head. "There's nothing to tell. He's just a face from a time I don't want to remember." The wind picked up, brushing his hair across his forehead. And for the first time in years, I saw fear settle in his eyes. Not immediate, not sharp, but buried, old, patient. I moved a little closer, close enough to see how his breath hitched each time he looked toward the barn's shadow. "Mark," I said. "That man knew your father." He looked at him like. He cut me off, shaking his head hard. "Don't." But the word wavered. It wasn't a wall. It was a splintering board trying to hold under too much weight. You can't keep pretending this is nothing, I whispered. He didn't toast for strangers. He spoke like someone digging up history. A bitter sound escaped him, half laugh, half breath. I hoped, he paused, pressing his palm to his forehead like the sentence hurt. I hoped this day would come without him. The words fell heavy between us, shifting the night in a way that made my chest tighten. This day? I repeated. You expected him? Mark exhaled a long, shaking breath, and for the first time since he was a boy, he wouldn't look at me. Not out of defiance, out of shame. I knew someday he'd show up, he admitted. People like him, they don't stay gone. Not forever. I felt something cold slide down my spine. Because he didn't say men like him. He said people like him. People tied to the land. People tied to our past. People my husband had known as a boy, and suddenly I understood. Mark wasn't just afraid of that man. He'd been waiting for him. Dreading him. Like waiting for a ghost that never learned how to stay dead. The moon slipped behind a slow-moving cloud, dimming the field until everything looked softer, older. Mark leaned heavily against the fence, head bowed, breath shaking like something inside him was giving way. I placed my hand on his arm. Not to comfort, but to steady us both. You and your father, I whispered. You both know him, don't you? Mark didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. The quiet was full enough. Somewhere in the barn, the music changed to a slow song, the kind meant for promises. But out here, it only sharpened the distance between what was celebrated and what was breaking. Mark finally lifted his eyes toward the dark horizon, where the stranger had disappeared. He was never supposed to come back, he said, and the night felt like it agreed. The land did too. The barn doors were cracked open just enough for the night air to slip through, carrying the smell of cut grass and something older. Soil turned over too many times. Lantern light spilled across the threshold, soft and golden, but it stopped short of the man standing half in shadow. People still laughed somewhere behind me, trying to stitch the night back together after his toast. But the sound felt distant, like a radio left on in an empty room. He didn't move when I stepped toward him. Didn't pretend he wasn't waiting. Just stood there with his hands loose at his sides, like he'd known this moment was coming long before I did. The reception had slipped into that uneasy place between celebration and exhaustion. Women kicked off their shoes, men loosened their ties, and the music kept trying to convince everyone that nothing unusual had happened. But the air still held his words. Truth before land. They clung to the rafters like dust. Mark had disappeared into a cluster of relatives, moving too quickly, smiling too hard. Whenever he turned, he avoided the barn doors entirely. I knew that avoidance. I'd seen it in him as a boy. When he'd break something and hide the pieces before anyone noticed the sound, I waited a while before going after the stranger. Pretended to refill my glass. Pretended to straighten a tablecloth. Pretended I wasn't afraid of what I'd hear if I walked toward him. But the pull was stronger than the fear. Something in the way he'd looked at Mark, steady, knowing, had struck a place I didn't realize was still tender. When I reached the doors, the wind pushed them wider, and the barn behind me dimmed just slightly. The stranger turned only his eyes toward me. Not surprised. Not guarded. Just ready. Evening, ma'am, he said softly, as if he didn't want the night to hear him. He reached into his jacket pocket without looking away, and for a second I thought he might pull out another riddle disguised as a blessing. But instead, he held out a small photograph. The edges curled inward, as though it had been clenched one too many times by a hesitant hand. I hesitated before taking it. The paper was cool, almost damp, like it had been carried close to the chest for years. Two boys stood in a field I knew too well. Our field. The tall grass brushing their legs, the fence line crooked in the background, the sky washed out from summer heat. One boy was unmistakably Mark. Younger, thinner, sun in his eyes. The other boy was him. You knew my son, I said. My voice barely carried. He nodded once. We worked this land together. Every summer for 3 years. The barn hummed behind us, the muffled pulse of music, the occasional burst of distant laughter. But his voice stayed steady, untouched by the chaos inside. We were close, he murmured. Closer than most boys our age knew how to be honest about. He didn't explain. Didn't need to. Something in the space between his words felt heavy enough to bend the air around us I kept staring at the photograph, tracing the shape of Mark's hand resting lightly on the other boy's shoulder. The gesture was small, almost shy. But there was trust in it. There was something warm. Something unguarded. What happened? I finally asked. The stranger looked past me, toward the dark field stretching beyond the barn. The same field from the photo, though time had carved deeper lines into it now. One night, he said, we stayed out later than we should have. Talking. About futures we weren't sure we were allowed to want. His breath fogged lightly in the cool air. When the lights from the farmhouse came on, Mark panicked. Said people wouldn't understand. Said his father would. He trailed off, jaw tightening just enough for me to see that I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I knew my husband's temper the way one knows a storm, by the way it shifts the air before it breaks. He told me to leave, the stranger continued. Told me not to come back. Said it'd be safer for both of us if I disappeared. He finally looked at me again, and there was no anger in his eyes. Just hurt that had been carried too far for too long. I didn't know if he meant it, he whispered, or if he was just afraid. The photograph blurred in my hand as tears threatened, though none fell. The night seemed to press in closer, listening. What changed everything? I asked that he exhaled. He ran. I stayed. That's all it took. The wind shifted, brushing the photograph against my fingers. I could almost hear the field from the picture, summer insects buzzing, boys' laughter swallowed by tall grass, the soft thud of footsteps running in opposite directions. Behind us, the barn doors creaked like they remembered. Why come back now? I asked quietly. The stranger looked toward the lights of the reception, then back to the field, as if weighing which world he belonged to. Because only one of us got to keep living like nothing happened, he said. And I couldn't carry both our ghosts anymore. I closed my hand around the photograph. It felt lighter than the truth it carried. Somewhere in the barn, Mark laughed again, too loud, too sharp, and standing there in the doorway, I knew the night wasn't done unearthing what he'd buried. Rain has a way of holding its echo long after the storm has passed. Even now, standing with the stranger beside the barn doors, I could almost hear it again. The steady drumming on tin, the water rushing through the fence lines, the land swallowing whatever secrets fell into it, that he held the photograph between us like it weighed far more than paper. And when he began speaking, his voice was soft, but it carried the heaviness of something that had waited decades to be said aloud. Every word he offered felt like a drop of that old rain falling again, one by one, onto a night I had tried not to remember. The reception behind us hummed with the gentle noise of celebration. Cutlery clinking, a burst of laughter, boots shuffling against the wooden floor. None of it reached the stranger. He stood as though he'd stepped out from a different season entirely. The lantern by the barn door flickered, painting his face in gold and shadow. His eyes looked older when the light hit them, tired but certain. I found myself clutching my shawl tighter, the night suddenly colder. I thought you should hear it from me, he said. Not from the land. The land. The way he said it made something inside me shift uneasily that he took a slow breath and began talking about a storm. That storm, the one I hadn't allowed myself to revisit. The one that tore through our valley when Mark was just a boy. But as the stranger spoke, memories pressed in from the edges. Mark, dripping from head to toe when he came through my kitchen door. The way his boots had left heavy, misshapen prints across the floor. How he refused to meet my eyes, that I'd let his silence become my answer, that I hadn't asked what he'd been running from. Now, standing beside this man, I felt foolish for thinking storms only took down trees, that he turned the photo over in his hand once, like he needed the boys in it to steady him. It started with the fence, he said. The wind snapped the center post clean through. My brother and I went out to help your Mark fix it. He paused, eyes drifting past me to the open field, dark, quiet, too calm for the weight of his words. They were arguing before we even reached the break, he continued. Boys fight. I know that. But this wasn't that kind of fight. I felt my breath stall. The memory of Mark's clenched jaw, his trembling hands, surfaced too easily. The rain was coming sideways, the stranger said. Hard enough to blind you. Hard enough to drown out anything you didn't want heard. He shifted, and the gravel crunched beneath his boots. My brother pushed him, he said softly. Or maybe Mark pushed him first. It doesn't matter now. What matters is he didn't get up. My fingers tightened around the fabric of my shawl that he swallowed. Mark told me he ran. Said he took off through the field and didn't look back. His voice thinned. But boys don't run like that. Not in that kind of rain. Somewhere deep in the barn, someone cheered. The sound floated out into the night, light and careless, so painfully wrong in its innocence. The stranger's gaze found mine then, steady and unflinching. I went back the next morning, he said. When the storm cleared. The fence was fixed. The ground around it looked disturbed. The word lodged itself in my ribs, disturbed. The image rose in my mind without permission, Mud packed under Mark's nails, the way he avoided the field for weeks afterward, how the dogs kept sniffing at one patch of earth like it carried a scent that didn't belong to them. "I called for him," the stranger whispered, voice breaking for the first time. "I called for my brother until my throat bled." He wiped his nose with the back of his hand, quick, embarrassed. "Your husband told me to go home. Said boys wander. Said the land holds things until it's ready to give them back." Mark's father, my husband. Both insisting the same story, I felt the memory pressing harder now. Mark coming through our door that night, soaked through, eyes hollow. How he flinched when lightning cracked outside. How he hadn't let me touch his jacket, hanging it himself like it was something fragile. Or guilty. "Tell me," I said, though my voice barely carried. "What are you saying happened?" He didn't answer that he didn't need to. The silence filled in the rest. The field. The storm. The hurried hands working in mud turned to clay beneath the weight of rain. A pit formed deep in my stomach, cold and crawling. If what he implied was true, then my land, our land, wasn't just holding history. It was holding a child. A breeze cut across the field, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth. It hit me so suddenly, so sharply, that it stole my breath. He looked out over the grass, jaw tight. "I've spent half my life listening to rain," he murmured, hoping one day it would tell me where he went. The barn door creaked behind us, warm light spilling out in a soft rectangle across the dirt. It didn't reach the stranger. It barely reached me. In the dark, the field stretched wide and quiet, too quiet, like it was holding its breath, and I found myself wondering, with a kind of trembling dread I'd never known before, what else had I walked over? What else had I tended? What else had I loved without ever knowing what lay beneath? Daniel's footsteps were so soft I almost didn't hear them, just the faint scuff of dress shoes against the old wooden floor. The light from the kitchen doorway caught the edge of his face, turning him pale, almost translucent, like someone seeing winter for the first time. He stood there between us, the stranger and me, his shoulders drawn in, his breath shallow. And when he finally spoke, his voice didn't rise above a whisper. It sounded like something breaking quietly from the inside. I had never seen my son look so young. Not even when he was a boy, running barefoot through the field, chasing fireflies that glowed like tiny lanterns. Maybe it was the way he held his hands, slightly open, trembling, as if he were afraid to touch the truth hanging in the air. The room felt smaller than it should have been. The walls breathed with us, the floor held its own kind of silence, and the single bulb above the table hummed like it knew something I didn't. The stranger didn't move. He just looked at Daniel with a kind of tired sorrow, like he'd already imagined this moment 1,000 times on long, sleepless nights. I kept thinking how strange it was that grief has a way of finding us even when we lock every door. How it seeps through tiny cracks, making itself at home in the quiet corners. And I knew Daniel had heard enough, maybe too much. His father's secrets, the storm, the lost boy. All the things I'd spent decades burying under chores and seasons, and the kind of silence that keeps a family stitched together. Daniel took a breath that barely made it past his lips. "Mom, what is he saying?" And for the first time in years, I didn't have an answer that could keep him safe. Daniel stepped closer, his eyes locked on the stranger. There was no anger in them. No fire, just a hollow kind of ache, the kind that grows when the ground under your childhood begins to crack. "Are you here for revenge?" he asked, voice wavering. "Or answers?" The stranger's mouth moved, but no sound came at first. He wet his lips, glanced at the window as if searching for something out in the night, and then spoke in a tone that sounded worn thin. "Neither," he said. "I've lived too long with both." His gaze drifted to the floor, to the faded rug Daniel used to build toy roads on. "I just want acknowledgement," he whispered. A name spoken out loud. Someone to say he mattered. Something in Daniel shifted. His shoulders stiffened, then dropped, like he'd been holding himself up with old assumptions that suddenly vanished. He turned slowly toward me, searching my face for a truth I'd never been brave enough to offer. "Mom," he said, "I always felt something was unfinished in this house. Like a room we never opened." His words landed heavy, and the stranger's quiet breathing filled the spaces between us. Daniel rubbed his hands together, as if trying to warm them. "Just tell me," he whispered. "What did I grow up on? What did I play on every summer?" The room felt colder, though nothing in it had changed. Just the truth, shifting, stretching, slowly rising from the places I kept it buried. I looked at Daniel, and he looked back at me with a kind of fragile courage I wasn't ready for. A soft crease formed between his brows, a silent plea. The stranger stepped forward, not threatening, not imposing, just present, and somehow that was worse. You played on innocence, he said, voice steady but soft. On land meant to grow things, not hide them. Daniel flinched like the words struck something deep. He stared at the floorboards, the same ones his father once stained with rainwater, and mud. The night everything changed. And the boy? Daniel asked, swallowing hard. Your brother? The stranger nodded, breathing out slowly. He never ran away. He paused, letting the quiet settle into every corner. My mother waited for him every night until she died. She kept his shoes by the door. Just in case. Daniel pressed his palm to his forehead, fingers splayed, as if trying to hold his thoughts in place. How does someone live with that? He murmured. How do I live with it now? I wanted to reach for him, to hold my son the way I used to when storms rattled the windows, but my hands stayed at my sides. Fear can freeze even a mother's instinct. Daniel, I whispered. But he didn't look up. He just kept staring at the floor, like he could already see the truth buried beneath it. Daniel finally lifted his head. The boy I raised was still in his eyes. But now he stood beside a man trying to rebuild himself from the inside out. He took a small step back, as if the room had become too full of ghosts. His voice was barely audible when he spoke again. I played on that land, he said. My whole life, and I never knew. The stranger bowed his head slightly, not in victory, not in accusation, but in recognition. Outside, the wind brushed against the window, carrying the smell of the field with it, that familiar earth, the same soil that had fed us, sheltered us, and maybe held someone else all along. Daniel exhaled, slow, uncertain. Mom, what do we do now? His question hung in the air, trembling like something newly unearthed. The first snow of the year always falls quietly on our land, like it's apologizing for intruding. That evening, the flakes drifted down in slow, trembling spirals, settling on the dark furrows that carved through the field. I'd walked those lines my whole life, never thinking to question why they stayed so straight, so undisturbed. But as I stood there, boots sinking into the cold earth, breath rising like smoke, I felt the truth beneath me. Heavy, waiting, like the ground had been holding its breath for decades. And Mark looked like he'd finally run out of places to hide. I found him standing near the center of the field, the same stretch of land he'd always called the heart of the property. Funny, how I used to believe him. How I trusted the way he'd pat the soil with his boot and say this ground had a strong memory. Now, watching him under the soft gray of the winter sky, I realized he meant something else entirely. Snow gathered on his shoulders, clinging to the fabric of his old coat. He didn't brush it off. He didn't turn when I approached. He just stared at the furrows. Straight as a ruler, unweathered by time, untouched by the wandering patterns of plow or season. Behind us, I could hear the faint creak of the fence. The stranger stood there, his outline framed by falling flakes, watching with a stillness that made the air feel thinner. I stopped a few feet behind Mark. Close, but not close enough to share warmth. Tell me, I said softly. My voice barely carried in the open field, but Mark heard it. His shoulders tightened. Like a man who'd been walking for years and suddenly realized there was no path left in front of him. The snow kept falling. The world kept waiting. I could see it white against the growing dusk, shaking like something breaking free inside him. I thought, he began, but the words tangled, caught somewhere between confession and fear. When he finally turned toward me, his eyes looked older than I'd ever seen them, not tired, just worn down by whatever truth he'd been burying beneath this field. It wasn't supposed to happen, he said. He was just a boy. They were both just boys. The snow collected in the lines of his face, melting as it touched his skin. His hands hung at his sides, fingers curled into themselves. He went down hard, Mark whispered. One hit on a rock. I thought he'd fainted. Just fainted. I kept shaking him, calling his name. He looked past me, toward the stranger at the fence. He didn't wake up. The wind pushed a thin breath of winter across the field, carrying the scent of cold soil and something older, something that had waited patiently for this moment. I panicked, Mark continued. Storm was coming in fast. Thunder already rolling. I thought, if anyone finds him on our land, my father would lose everything. They'd say it was foul play. They'd come after us. After me. He took a step back, boots sinking deeper. I didn't mean to bury him, he said. It became the only thing left to do. The snow thickened, softening the edges of everything. Our tracks, the furrows, even the fence line where the stranger stood gripping the rails with white-knuckled hands. Mark sank slowly to his knees, like the weight of the years had finally dragged him down. He pressed his palms into the earth, fingers disappearing into the softening snow. I dug with my hands at first, he said. The storm was roaring, lightning splitting the sky. I thought it would wash everything clean. Cover the ground. Hide the mound. His voice cracked, not in a dramatic way, just small, like something quietly giving up. I was going to tell someone the next day. I swear it. But the storm, he shook his head. You remember how it rained, Ellen. You remember how long it lasted. I did. The storm that took the power out for 3 days. The storm that left the field looking new, like nothing had ever happened. But every day after, he continued, I found a new reason not to say anything. Your father got sick. Then the baby was coming. Then the farm needed repairs. And every season, the soil settled a little more, and I kept thinking, maybe silence was its own kind of mercy. I couldn't speak, not yet. Behind us, the stranger took one step forward, then stopped, his breath hitching. Tears streaked down his face, freezing at the edges, and suddenly the field didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt shared, haunted, held. The snow covered Mark's knees, the tops of his boots, the trembling in his hands. He didn't wipe his face. He didn't look up. I stood there, the cold seeping into my bones, listening to the quiet between us, thick, full, impossible to ignore. The stranger leaned on the fence, his shoulders shaking as he tried to hold himself together. What justice can be found, I whispered, when everything is so many years too late? Mark closed his eyes, breath shallow. I don't know, he said. But I can't ask forgiveness. Not for this. The field stretched out around us, white, silent, and suddenly unbearably honest. And as the snow kept falling, I felt something in the earth shift, like truth settling, like a story finally ready to be unearthed. What do we do now? I whispered into the cold air. The field, as always, gave no answer. The sirens didn't wail. They only hummed low across the fields, as if even the authorities knew they were intruding on something private. Something the land itself had been keeping folded beneath its surface. I watched their headlights crawl slowly down our dirt road, soft beams cutting through the falling snow. The field, our field, looked still, too still, like a held breath. And beside me, Daniel's fingers tightened around mine. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. We both knew that once the digging began, nothing buried out here, truth or body, would stay quiet again. The wedding music had stopped a long time ago. The last notes from the band still clung faintly to the cold air, like a memory refusing to disperse. Guests stood scattered in small clusters near the barn, their shoes sinking into the softening earth. The white decorations looked out of place now, like they belonged to someone else's evening. I could hear their whispers drift on the breeze. Pieces of sentences barely formed. What's happening? Why the police? Did someone get hurt? But no one stepped too close to us. They all watched from that small, safe distance people keep when they sense a family breaking. Mark stood apart from everyone, his coat unbuttoned, snow collecting in the open collar. He didn't lift his head when the officers approached him. He only nodded. Slowly, like each motion carried weight, and pointed toward the straight lines of the field. The stranger walked a few steps ahead of the authorities. Not proud, not vindicated. Just steady. As though his heart was years ahead of his feet and had already arrived at the place they were going. Daniel stayed beside me, his breath trembling. Mom, he murmured, I don't know how to watch this. I squeezed his hand, though my own was shaking. I don't either, I whispered. Snow kept falling, covering the field like it wanted to soften what was coming, but couldn't. The officers set up small lanterns around the site, their lights warm against the blue dusk. One asked Mark quietly, Here. Mark's answer was barely a nod. Barely anything at all. The stranger stepped forward and touched one of the furrows with his glove. Right along this line, he said, voice a thin thread in the cold. He dug it straight. He was always precise. His words weren't cruel. They were tired in a way only years of not knowing can carve into a person. Daniel leaned against me, his breath hitching softly. He used to take me out here, he whispered. He said this part of the land grew the strongest crops. Said it was blessed soil. The first shovel broke through the thin layer of snow. The sound, metal striking frozen ground, rang across the field like a dull bell. Each officer dug slowly, respectfully. Not like men searching for evidence. More like men unwrapping something fragile. Mark stood motionless, eyes fixed on the earth. Every so often, a tremor moved through him, as if the cold were finally reaching his bones or truth was. The stranger stayed near the fence line, hands clasped, too weary to step closer but too bound to look away. The air tasted of frost and old secrets, of soil turning over after decades of silence. Daniel whispered, This doesn't feel real. I didn't answer. The digging echoed across the field. Real enough that IT didn't take long. The ground here was soft, softer than it ever should be in winter. The officers slowed their digging, exchanging glances that said more than words could point. One of them crouched and brushed snow away with his bare hand. And then, everything went still. Even the wind seemed to stop to listen. I felt Daniel's grip tighten painfully around my fingers. Mark took one step forward, then stopped, as if something rooted him in place. The stranger bowed his head, shoulders trembling once. A small bundle of cloth appeared through the loosened dirt, faded, mud-stained, time-worn in the gentlest, saddest way. The officer touched it like a fragile relic. He whispered something to another man, who nodded and stepped aside to radio it in. But I didn't hear the words. All I heard was Daniel's breath break beside me. And Mark's knees hit the ground a moment later, soft, sinking, like the earth had finally claimed him too. The stranger walked to me slowly, not triumphant, not angry, just human. "Thank you," he said softly, "for listening. People don't usually listen when the truth hurts them." His eyes were red, but there was something else in them, something like release, or the closest thing to it a man in mourning can feel. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came. Not apology, not comfort, just silence. A heavy, respectful silence. The kind that knows it's intruding on grief. The light faded behind the clouds, turning the field into a muted wash of blue and gray. The lanterns flickered, casting soft halos over the disturbed earth. Daniel slid his arm around me, grounding me as much as he needed grounding himself. The wedding dress his wife wore, somewhere behind us, felt like a cruel detail in a story rewritten by the soil. I looked over the land I'd tended, trusted, believed in. It looked unfamiliar now. Like it had been carrying someone else's story all along. The stranger exhaled, a thin white cloud in the cold. "Maybe now," he whispered, "we can all begin again." But I wasn't sure, because beginning again meant standing on ground that had stopped pretending, ground that had given back what it once agreed to hide, and I didn't yet know how to walk across it without hearing the echoes underneath.